that we're expecting. But while we're waiting, shall I go ahead and introduce Albert? So welcome everybody to our first in a two-part series with Albert Coffey, The People of the Sun, Origins of the Aztec. Albert Coffey is an archaeologist and federally licensed tour guide who has participated in excavation and ethnographical studies in the area near and around San Miguel de Allende. His passion is sharing what he has learned through tours that he gives to the archaeological site Cañada de la Virgen, other sites in the state of Guanajuato, and throughout Mexico. This two-part webinar series goes to support additional historical research, including the rescue of legends and wisdom of the elders of the nearby rural indigenous communities, and provide aid to transport and support staff who have also been out of work due to the global pandemic. So with that, Ginger, did you want to announce our upcoming webinar options?
Yes, we have, well, the second part of this webinar will be next week, same time, same place, with Albert Coffey, the continuation of this program. And then on, I have my calendar in front of me, on August, I don't remember.
Sorry,
on August,
threw it at you. August 13th.
I know. August 13th, we have, who, Rebecca?
Oh, we have Les Carmona. Chef Les Carmona will be talking about the Milpa Mesoamericana, the Three Sisters, Seven Warriors. And then after,
all about food.
Yeah, all about food. We're trying to figure out how to do a virtual food tasting.
Yeah.
So if anybody has any ideas about that. And then
food and nutrition from the perspective of from the native people. So it's going to be super interesting. And on August 18th, we have Alberto Lenz is going to return to talk about a specific figure in Mexican art history who is Nacio Lean. She is the figurehead in art and the feminist movement in Mexico. And so that was specifically requested by several people that came to his webinar before when he was talking about some of the big figures in muralism, because she was so involved in the art world during that time. So I hope that you can join us for that. All of our whole calendar is available on our website. I put it up in the chat, languageadventurepost.com/webinars, and all of our webinars are recorded and available to watch after that. Also, if you have not donated for this series, please do so on the description of Albert's webinar, and there's a button there, and let me know if you have any problems. Somebody out there had a problem with the PayPal. If you do, let me know and I'll give you some other options. And I think that's it.
Take it away, Albert.
All right, thank you very much for inviting me to do this again. I always find it hard to believe that this many people would take a break from their busy Netflix schedules to attend my webinar. Does anyone out there remember Ozark? Those seem like the good old days. Seems like a long time ago. I've gotten through most of the good Netflix series, so I was able to focus more on what I do, which is talk about the pre-Hispanic history of Mexico. Now, I'll explain what this is. The people of the sun refers to, in general, Mesoamerican peoples and the Aztecs in particular. My idea is to make the people of the sun a series of webinars, this being the first installment, and named, of course, Origins of the Aztecs. Now, there's so many aspects of Aztec and Mesoamerican culture that it's impossible to fit these into these short 1-hour segments. So what I'm trying to do, and this is off of some advice I'd gotten from a couple of people who attended the last time, is I'm trying not to get through too much extensive information packed into one short time period, but I want to break these into increments and focus on different aspects: art, architecture, religion, astronomy, legend, archaeological record, different aspects of Aztec and Mesoamerican culture. The first installment is the origins of the Aztecs, and in this one, my main objective is to focus on some of the stories, legends, and myths surrounding the Aztecs' origins and their own belief systems, symbolism as they relate to Mexico's national identity. Now, but my interest in the Aztecs started when I was in the 3rd grade, and my 3rd grade teacher had us do projects on ancient civilizations. I chose the Aztecs and the Incas. From there, my grandfather, who had an extensive collection of National Geographics I read through when I was a child, also inspired me to study this, and then on into college. Questions come up recently is what is the difference between an anthropologist and an archaeologist? In Mexico and parts of Europe, archaeology and anthropology are broken apart into 2 different academic trajectories and courses of study, intimately tied to each other. And the United States, at Louisiana State University and the majority of accredited universities in the US, anthropology covers 4 different branches of study. That includes cultural anthropology, the study of the contemporary cultures; linguistics, the study of languages, of course; physical anthropology, the study of the human body, evolution; primatology and forensics are intimately linked to that; and archaeology, the study of the material remains of culture as a means to interpret prehistoric and historic history of humans, human prehistory and history. When you study anthropology in the United States, at least, your coursework in college, your further studies, and your work in the field dictate which of those branches you go down and which you become. In my case, at Louisiana State University, my coursework was focused on mainly the archaeology of Mesoamerica, which includes all of Mexico to the south of us and parts of Central America. That was what my professor's expertise was. I went on to work as an archaeologist field technician doing commercial archaeology throughout the American Southeast, mainly doing excavation and surveys throughout the American Southeast, but my main interest was this part of the world. So about 17 years ago, I planned a journey to Latin America, well, to here, to immerse myself in what I mainly studied. So that's that. The Incas, the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Maya are the most recognizable of pre-Columbian cultures in this hemisphere. The Maya, of course, because they took everything to its most advanced level, be it architecture, be it religion, astronomy, art, writing system. They occupy the largest geographical territory of Mesoamerica, being the Yucatan Peninsula, parts of Mexico, and Central America. The Incas and the Aztecs are most recognizable, mainly because they are the 2 groups of people who the Spanish came into contact when they first entered the inland parts of Mexico and Peru. So they're the most recognizable. Many other cultures led up to them. Bear with me as we go along, because some of these Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language, names of people and places are hard to pronounce, even for me. I'm going to try to get through that, and at times I'll try to refer to their literal translations to make it more clearly presented to people. So that you know, this also, it's been a learning process. This is all a learning process for me. So as I prepare for these, I learn as I go. So I hopefully can present to you what I have gleaned from the experience. But the Aztec and Mesoamerican vision of time was cyclical. These are stories within stories, legends within legends, dreams within dreams, and visions within visions. Cyclical vision of time means that they didn't necessarily talk about things in a linear fashion. They were often a mix of myth and history. Oftentimes, they linked deified rulers with legendary events and mythical figures. That being said, let's get into it. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, this is my lead-in. There is a mysterious and sacred place in Mexico, perhaps a mythical homeland, from which 7 tribes embarked on a long journey. They were groups of fierce warriors who migrated into foreign lands and stopped along the way to perform a ritual at a sacred mountain to emerge from 7 caves, reborn. It was a rebirth ritual, a ceremonial rebirth. There were several of these waves of migration and the symbolism associated with them, which were some of the most crucial factors in the development of Mexico's national identity. The immigrants were the Acolhua, the Tepanecs, the Otomi, the Aztecs, and other tribes loosely referred to as Chichimec. According to the Aztecs, they had come from Aztlan, or the place of white herons. The ritual they performed was at the curved peak of a mountain called Culhuacan and the 7 caves of Chicomostoc. It was there that they became the Mexica. Thus, it was proclaimed by their great leader and patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, or hummingbird on the left, the god of the sun, of war, and sacrifice. They traveled southward. Their destination was the present-day Valley of Mexico and the Great Lake Texcoco, where, along its banks, other tribes of noble lineage had already entered and settled and formed alliances. For reasons we don't yet fully understand, they were looking for a new home. They also sought to claim the greatness that was prophesied by their leader, Huitzilopochtli, who told them it was to be their destiny. They and their descendants were to build an empire that would come to dominate other people who occupied the central Mexican highlands and far beyond for almost 2 centuries. Could it be, here's the question, could it be that we're closer than ever to discovering if indeed this mythical homeland called Aztlan, this legendary birthplace, actually existed, and if so, where? The answer could be that it was a lot closer to home than a lot of us may have imagined. About 12 years ago, I was contracted by the landowner of the Hacienda Cañada de la Virgen, upon which the archaeological site where I participated in the excavation is located. She contracted me to compile a documentation of the legends, wisdom, and memories of the elders of the ranch communities in the surrounding area and people born on the property. One of the first places I visited was a place called a communal ranch called Toriles. There I met an elderly man they called Don Gabino. What he told me was a story that may help to clear up and to answer some of these questions. Now, having Mexican children, I married a Mexican woman when I first came and had Mexican children. They put me on a fast track to becoming a Mexican citizen. One of the proudest days of my life was about 2 years ago when I became a naturalized Mexican citizen. And it restoked an already burning flame that was my desire, is my desire to further interpret and understand Mexico's rich and colorful past. As I try to navigate through these trying times during the pandemic and in the present, I look to my children and I realize that I'm pretty much inextricably tied to Mexico's future as well. But pre-Hispanic peoples, including the Aztecs, were obsessed with timekeeping and organizing themselves in terms of past, present, and future, and organizing themselves and situating themselves into the cosmos. So hopefully this will help to clear some of that up. Now, they mix myth with reality, and the elders are the ones who pass this down to the younger generation. A lot of that information is being lost over time. So I'll continue to try to find a clear understanding of this, this region's unique archaeological record and to retrieve more of these local people's oral histories. The donations that you give and your attendance of the webinar really helped me in that endeavor. So let's get started. I'm not able to move from one slide to the next. Hold on a second. Okay. I'm not sure what's happening, but I cannot get my slide to move. Oh boy, that's not supposed to happen. Technical difficulties here at the beginning. Not sure what's happening there. I can't get my slides move. So I got my technical support guy who's coming on. He's going to help me get that fixed. He's telling me. Just give me a minute or two here. Basic function. Not working. Hang on there. Well, not working. Boy, I'm running out. Please bear with me. We're going to get it fixed. All right. I'll continue while we get this fixed. I'll continue with the information I'm going to present to you. And I'll start with this. When Cortez arrived on the coast of Veracruz, on the Gulf Coast, east coast of Mexico in 1519, and they made their way inland to inland Mexico towards the great city of Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztecs, they passed through a cold pass between two mountains. Those two mountains were Popocatépetl, or Smoking Mountain, an active volcano, and Ixtaccihuatl, or Sleeping Woman, a dormant volcano. The story about these two, the Aztec legend about these two mountains that form the eastern edges of the Valley of Mexico, and where was located Lake Texcoco, Lake of the Moon, the legend is that there was an Aztec prince and an Aztec princess. They were deeply in love with each other. The Aztec prince went off to war. His rival, an enemy, was also in love with the princess. So while the original prince was off at war, he told the Aztec princess that the prince had died in combat. Of course, she was very sad about this, and she died of sorrow. When the Aztec prince came back from war to the great city of Tenochtitlan, he discovered that she had died and carried her body to the top of a mountain, where he looked over her sleeping body with a torch. She became Sleeping Woman, Ixtaccihuatl, and he became Popocatépetl, Smoking Mountain. As soon as we get the image up, I'm going to show you what they look like so you can see what I'm talking about. That refers to what we call a sacred landscape. The stars, the sun, the moon, the cosmos, the constellations, the moving planets were considered manifestations of Mesoamerican deities, as were the hills and mountains on the horizon. Okay, let me see if this works. Okay, I've got it now. Okay, here is Ixtaccihuatl, and here is Popocatépetl. I taught a third grade class at a bilingual school in town, and the third grade students made me repeat the word Popocatépetl 7 times every day before I entered the class until I was able to pronounce it fluently. So I was able to get that done. Here's an image of the two. You can see that the profile of this mountain, Sleeping Woman, looks like a woman sleeping. See more clearly here. And that's the legend of the two mountains. Now, just so that everyone's clear about what time period we're talking about when the Spanish did enter the Valley of Mexico, 3 major time periods in Mesoamerican archaeology: the pre-classic period, lasted from 1800 to 150 AD. That's when the Olmec, the mother culture, the first advanced civilization in Mexico arose and introduced many different aspects, the diet based on corn, beans, and squash, monument building, unique calendar system, several different elements that made Mesoamerica what it was, a unique culture hearth, as were India, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Peru, Mesoamerica, among others. The post-classic period, or the classic period, saw the rise of the great metropolis, Teotihuacan, outside of Mexico City. Multicultural, homogenizing force that held power over all of Mesoamerica during what we call the classic period, between 150 to 650 AD, when art, writing, architecture, astronomy reached its highest, most refined level, because it was a period of relative peace. When that great city collapsed around 650 AD, a huge power vacuum was created, and the post-classic period began. A warlike time marked by the rise of military chiefdoms competing over resources and a power vacuum. And that led up to the last 200 years before the Spanish came, the Aztec period, 1325, when the Aztecs entered the Valley of Mexico, and as I stated here, up to 1519, the time of the Spanish arrival. Some would put that at 1521 or 22, when they were actually finally conquered by the Spanish, but to me, I place it right there at 1519, and on November 8th, 1519, a man named Bernal Diaz was a soldier who went along with Cortez, one of the conquistadors. When they beheld, as they entered the Valley of Mexico and were on their way to this little place at the southern end of the lake called Ixtapalapa, they beheld the city of Tenochtitlan in the valley. And to give you an idea of what it was like for them, I'll quote from Bernal Diaz, who wrote his account when he was in his mid-80s and when he lived in Antigua, Guatemala. And he says, "During the morning, we arrived at a broad causeway and continued our march towards Ixtapalapa. And when we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway going towards Mexico, Mexico referring to Tenochtitlan, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. This city," and here you can see Ixtaccihuatl, sleeping woman, and Popocatépetl here in the background looking to the east. The causeways that led from the mainland at intervals were separated by bridges that could be taken away so that canoe traffic made it through. But the principal concept was a quadripartite vision of the cosmos and the world, divided, oriented towards the four cardinal directions, and organized into four quadrants. As you can see, these causeways intersected. Here, Calle Tacuba, the street that runs through present-day Mexico City, is the longest continually used street in all of Latin America, still in use today. But they met on a north-south, east-west axis at the sacred precinct here in the center. The bottom part of Tenochtitlan was a Chinampa city, Chinampa-style architecture being a method in which they cut large sections of lake vegetation. They made into floating gardens packed with mud from the bottom of the lake and anchored with reeds and willows and rectangular plots, cross-section and crossed by canals. Xochimilco in the southern part of Mexico City is a place where you can still ride in the boats through the canals that are the ancient raised fields. That style of agriculture goes back to the classic lowland Maya in places like central Yucatan and parts of Central America in the lowlands, the Petén, where they use the raised field style of agriculture and a unique hands-on growing practice where they grew corn, beans, squash, amaranth, chia. Another important source of protein, spirulina, which is like the algae that grows in the lake, was an important food product they made into cakes. And one of the ways that the Aztecs were able to survive in this this lagoon type setting. Here you can see some of the Chinampa style agriculture and paintings here. And the sacred precinct in the center was the center of their universe, where all four cardinal directions met in the center and the sacred precinct, they call it, surrounded by what they call a huatepantli, which is a snake wall, serpent wall that surrounded the sacred precinct and kept most of the commoners out. Here you have the double temple of Huitzilopochtli. Here, their sun and war, sacrifice god, and Tlaloc, the rain god. Double temple and duality, and a dual style of governance, something that was unique, not just to the Aztec, but many people who came before them. Other temples in the sacred precinct, circular ones dedicated to the god Quetzalcoatl and his aspect Ehecatl, the god of the wind, Tezcatlipoca, the god of deceit, sorcery, darkness, death, and the underworld, both of which I'll be mentioning along the way. The sacred precinct was the sacred heart of the Aztec universe. The area they dominated at the time of the Spanish arrival included the central part around Mexico City, the central highlands of Mexico. The actual geographical center of Mexico is more up here where we are around San Miguel de Allende, Guanajuato, but this was the sacred heart of the Aztec universe, both geographically and cosmologically, if that's a word. Other areas, tribute states. Their economy was based on free market, agriculture, and tribute, and the people they dominated owed tribute to the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker chief, they called him. At the time of the Spanish arrival, that was Moctezuma, mispronounced by many as Montezuma, one of 11 different Tlatoani, or supreme rulers, who ruled the Aztecs from the 1370s until 1519. A warrior society. War was a way of life for the Aztecs. This has a lot to do with the fact that Huitzilopochtli, their patron deity, who I'll be talking about more, was an insatiable deity who needed a constant, steady flow of human blood to be appeased. And sacrifice is embedded into their creation stories, which I'll be getting to shortly. The atlatl was a weapon that goes back to the big game hunters who hunted mammoth and whatnot. A stick here with a hook on the end that hooked into the base of the arrow and extended it. You're throwing, actually added an extra arm basically, or joint, which extended the velocity and trajectory and distance of the arrow, allowed the Aztecs to subdue large groups of people from a long distance. Spears, obsidian blades set into the tips, the sling, and the club embedded with obsidian blades. Unfortunately, obsidian, being the sharpest naturally occurring substance on Earth, is rather brittle and usually only for one use, and would break very easily on the armor of the Spanish. So one of the reasons the Spanish were able to subdue the Aztecs rapidly was not only that, but of course the diseases they brought with them. The actual downfall of the Aztec city I'm going to talk about in the next session next week. But warfare to them was what they call the Flowery War, an ongoing war where they continually instigated battles with other people they dominated so that they could acquire sacrificial victims and extract tribute from those people they dominated. A Nahuatl, or Aztec poem, reads like this: "The battlefield is a place where one toasts the divine liquor in war, where are stained red the divine eagles, where the jaguars howl, where all kinds of precious stones rain from ornaments, where we wave headdresses rich with fine plumes, where princes are smashed to bits. There is nothing like death in war, nothing like the flowery death, so precious to him who gives life. Far off I see it, my heart learns for it. To die in combat, to rise into the realm of the sun god, was the most honorable death for an Aztec. Children, boys, when they were brought up, were told at a very young age that they were warriors. The house they lived in was only temporary, that their main objective was to bring back victims and to appease their deities through sacrifice. And that sacrifice was put on display at the Zompantli, the skull rack, where skulls, this is an ornamental skull rack, but the skull rack is where they placed the severed heads of sacrificial victims as a way of intimidating people they brought into their sacred precinct. This is the earliest map made of Tenochtitlan, which is literally translated the place where the cactus grows among the rocks. Tenoch was one of the first leaders who led some of these immigrant groups into the Valley of Mexico. And Tenochtitlan, the place of Tenoch, is appropriate. You can see it's laid out here to the four cardinal directions, that quadripartite vision of the universe and geography. That goes back to the Olmec. Here in Olmec art, you see what's called the Cruz de Andrés, which I talked about in the previous webinar, and the meeting of the four cardinal directions here in the center everything laid out to the 4 quadrants. 4 deities known as Pahuatun to the Mayas supported each corner of their universe. And the Peruvians had a very similar vision of geography and the universe in a quadripartite fashion. The quadripartite vision could also be seen here in an Olmec sculpture showing the mouth of a cave with an equilateral cross, and the ruler seated inside of the cave, and a universal element of origin stories throughout indigenous traditions in this part of the world and other parts of the world is that the original humans emerged from the womb of the earth, the mouth of the cave. Different symbols in Olmec writing that depict the different cardinal directions. And the quadripartite symbolism in the art of the Teotihuacan and the Aztecs, you can see here with the quadripartite flower, the 4-petaled flower that is depicted in the art of Teotihuacan and throughout many Aztec sites. But Teotihuacan is where this all originated. This laying out of a city on a north, south, east, west axis, laid out to the cardinal directions more or less with a slight deviation to showcase certain celestial events, goes back to Teotihuacan. And here you can see from the view at the end of the Avenue of the Dead at the Pyramid of the Moon, looking towards the Pyramid of the Sun, the way this building emulates the landscape beyond it. Incorporating the landscape and the sky into the architecture was one of the main objectives going back to the early pre-classic period. Another vision of their quadripartite vision of the world from a codex. These codices come mostly from the early 1500s, some from pre-conquest times. Most of these were burned by the Spanish, only a few left in existence that we know about. This one depicts the ancient fire god here in the center at the axis mundi, or the crossing point at the center of the universe. Here you see each cardinal direction laid out. This is east above, and where the rising sun arises. The west is here on the bottom. Each cardinal direction depicted by a special bird and tree. The actual identification of each species hard to come by, and then each quadrant, an arrow points here out into the 4 corners of their universe. Here, the Codex Mendoza, which is a pre-Columbian codex, shows again the cactus, the eagle, landing on it, which has become the Mexican flag, and laid out to the cardinal directions. Here's the Zompantli, the skull rack, and different tribes that occupied each different quadrant of their great city. And the Aztec sunstone. And here we'll talk about and get into some of the creation story. Now, the Aztecs had a vision of their past, a mythical past that included several different eras ending in destruction. Successive eras that were imperfect, where the gods tried to perfect the human race as they created humans and the sun, moon, the cosmos, and the present day world. They broke this into 5 suns or ages. The sunstone, which some have mistaken as a calendar, is not a calendar, but displays different artistic elements from the calendar system. You have what represents the celestial bodies in the sky, the fire serpent. Here's one that comes down, mouth open, human head emerging. Another fire serpent, their tails touching here, comes down, and a human head emerges from the mouth of the snake. This is an allusion to reverence of the ancestors and communication with the ancestors, ancestral veneration. The ancestor's face emerged from the vision serpent during ritual. Here you have the arrows that point to each cardinal direction, and those that point to the 4 corners. As I mentioned before, the quadripartite vision. Here at the top, you have what's called a date glyph. The date is 13 Reed, and that is the day upon which the 5th sun, which we are now living in, started. The 5th sun is depicted by what you see here. Tonatiuh, the sun god, with an obsidian tongue, and then this image that looks like an H, which is what you see here. This is actually a symbol that represents the word Oyin, which means movement, because the 5th age that we live in today was predicted to end in earthquakes. Whether that has to do with the 2012, December 21st, Mayan changing of the Great Cycle has yet been connected to the Aztec world. But here in this interior part, I'll show you more clearly, you have this ring where you have the 20-day symbols: death, ocelot, deer, rabbit, jaguar, eagle, movement, wind, reed, 20-day symbols matched with the numbers 1 through 13 that created their 260-day ritual or almanac calendar, which helped them in a divination to predict and to place themselves into a historical context. The Maya added to that and made it more complex. But that 260-day period, based on the time it takes for human gestation, the time it takes between zenith passages of the sun over southern Mexico, and the time it takes to get 2 corn crops in a season. And those are the internal elements. But each of these 4 ages that came before our 5th sun are depicted here. 4 jaguar. And this time it was believed that giants roamed the earth, did not sow maize or corn, did not plant crops, or lived off of roots and berries. They were devoured by a jaguar. And for that reason, the jaguar's head is a symbol for that, 4 jaguar. The next one is 4 wind, represented by the mask of Quetzalcoatl, the god associated with the wind. And it's called 4 wind because in this time, the human-like creatures that the gods had created were wiped away by heavy winds and hurricanes and turned into fish. Sorry, into birds. Then down here, you have 4 rain. If 4 rain, human-like creatures, which were monkey-like creatures, but not quite human, they were wiped out by a rain of fire and turned into birds. Up here it was fish in this one. And then the 4th age, 4 water, was destroyed by flooding, a great flood of fire. And this one, it was a normal flood. The flood of fire wiped out this the last age, and led us into the 5th age, where at Teotihuacan it is said by the Aztecs, the gods convened to create the present world, the sun, the moon, and humanity. Now, this is also where at Teotihuacan, at the Pyramid of the Sun and Moon, this legend occurred, and we also see aspects of the rain god here, Tlaloc, and the feathered serpent. Anytime you see in Teotihuacan art and Mesoamerican art, and this is Tlaloc, rain god, as impersonated by one of the elite rulers or speakers of Teotihuacan, this pearl coming from the mouth is what they call a speech scroll, and depicts this person as a ruler speaking. This is also where the warrior lineages of the eagle, jaguar, and coyote warrior started to emerge. These were the 3 lineages of warriors that the Aztecs embodied in their warrior society. And at Teotihuacan is where the gods convened to create the present age and sun. And there they were summoned and asked which god on the Pyramid of the Sun and Moon was willing to sacrifice himself into a great bonfire and become the sun for the present age. One they called the arrogant one, and one they called the humble one or the purulent one, Nanahuatzin, and the arrogant one. The arrogant one had a sacrificial kit of quetzal plumes, golden balls of feathers, the finest copal incense for his ceremony, and the humble one, Nanahuatzin, had regular maguey cactus spines for bloodletting. His own scabs were used as incense. Very modest deity. Now, when the gods summoned these 2 to sacrifice themselves to become the sun, the arrogant one, because of the flames and heat coming from the bonfire, turned away 4 times. He couldn't bring himself to throw himself into the fire to become the sun. So the humble one, Nanahuatzin, he worked up the courage immediately and jumped into the fire. At that point, the arrogant one saw him do this and developed the courage to do it as well, and he jumped in after. Nanahuatzin became the sun, and the arrogant one became the moon. The brilliance from the moon was so great also, well, the fire from the sun was great. As the priest or the gods looked around to see where the sun would rise, they looked to the east and saw the first rising sun, which was Nanahuatzin, the purulent one. The moon's brilliance was so great that they couldn't really take it, so one of the gods threw a rabbit onto the face of the moon, and that's why in ancient Mesoamerica, they viewed the moon as having a rabbit on its face and not the man in the moon as we see in Western society. Now, here you can see some elements of the calendar again, like 2 gears fit into each other, working together, matching up numbers and symbols. This system was embedded into a solar calendar of of 18 20-day months. 18, 20, 18 times 20, 360, 5 days added to that to make the 365-day solar calendar. They both work together to form a calendar system. I mentioned tribute. Here's a tribute list from the Aztec Empire. These are things like costumes made of jaguar hide, cotton uniforms, clothing for the warriors, food, luxury items brought in from the surrounding polities that were dominated by the Aztecs, from which they extracted tribute. The skull rack, forms of human sacrifice to appease their patron deities, included heart extraction, included a gladiatorial sacrifice where a victim was chained down to a stake and had to go into combat against a warrior with an obsidian club. And of course, the outcome was lopsided, but heart extraction, gladiatorial, disembowelment, animal attack, but all what we call reciprocal sacrifice associated with that initial sacrifice that was given by Nanahuatzin to create the sun. So that original sacrifice was embedded into their everyday life and their vision of ceremony. Here you can see the Mayan concept of the calendar with the two elements. You have the solar calendar on the outside with the numbers and symbols combined, and here in the internal part, the 260-day calendar embedded into it, turning and repeating every 52 years, at which point the new fire ceremony occurred, where a sacrificial victim was carried to the top of a mountain. All the lights in the city were doused. A new flame was ignited on the chest of a sacrificial victim. The flame was brought down into the city to ignite the all the flames and a new fire for the coming 52-year cycle. Every 52 years, the numbers and symbols repeated themselves, and that was the time at which the new fire ceremony was done. Duality, here's the death god, and Quetzalcoatl, the god of light, life, artistry, the wind, and knowledge. His counterpart, the god of death, sorcery, darkness, death, and the underworld. Other deities, Tlaloc, the rain god, Huitzilopochtli. Now, in the upcoming webinars and the next one next week, I'm going to talk in more detail. We're a little bit behind schedule because of our technical difficulties, but I'm going to talk more about specific deities. But some to note, Cuauhtlicue is this one. This is an Aztec earth goddess, the severed head. These two serpents meeting face to face to form a mouth that actually represent the blood from the severed head of a sacrificial victim. Hands and hearts as a necklace associated with the bosom and the giving of life. These are also these deities that are usually female earth deities associated with giving birth, but also devoured the dead. And these large claws you can see on the feet and hands were for grabbing those dead bodies, carrying them in to be consumed in the maw of the earth. That's one of their earth deities. Xochipilli was the god of the springtime. These are psychotropic peyote buttons painted on him. He's the god actually of the sun of summertime and associated with flowering and abundance and fertility. Other deities and codices I'm going to talk about in more detail in future episodes. Mixcoatl was the patron deity of the Otomi, one of the people who entered the Valley of Mexico early on, between about the 11th and 12th centuries. And he is depicted with a black around his eyes, a hunting god known as the traveler of the southern sky, and led his people south towards the Valley of Mexico when they abandoned sites like Tula, the Toltec capital. These are maize deities. Important god of maize was feminine. Another earth deity, Tlatzcuhtli, is in a birthing position. You can see the claws for carrying the dead into the womb of the earth. And this is a list of the different Tlatoani, or rulers of Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan. I'm going to talk about these in more detail in the next one. The one who was occupying, of course, at the time of Spanish arrival is Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. He is angry like a lord. And these are the interpretations of their names. I'm going to talk in more detail about what each one of these accomplished in an upcoming episode. But all of the people, the Acolhua, the Tepanecs, the Chichimecs, Tolteca, Chichimeca they were called, associated themselves with the noble holders of wisdom a warrior society known as the Toltecs, whose capital city was Tula. All the people in the Valley of Mexico at the time that the Mexica made their way, the Aztecs made their way into the Valley of Mexico, had to show that they could prove a relationship to these ancient people of wisdom who migrated south from the site of Tula, north of Mexico City, into the Valley of Mexico around the 12th century. These are the Atlantes. The butterfly symbol represents the warrior class. The butterfly was said to rise from the chest of a fallen warrior. These are actually columns that held up the roof of the central area of administration at Tula, Aztec capital. This is the chacmul, a dish upon which extracted hearts were placed after sacrifice. That's from Tula, Toltec Tula. Here's an Aztec chacmul. I took a course recently about Mesoamerican iconography that I needed to renew my credential as a tour guide, and the guy who did it didn't have enough time to get into that last part of it, which was the Aztec art and iconography, and he basically summarized it. He said, basically, Aztec art is Toltec art. But the story about the Toltecs is that Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was incarnated as Quetzalcoatl Topiltzin, a ruler of Toltec Tula. His arch rival, Tezcatlipoca, Smoking Mirror, the god of deceit, sorcery, darkness, the death in the underworld, was incarnated as a rival ruler. They were at odds with each other. At one point, because Tezcatlipoca was all about human sacrifice and the feathered serpent was against it, only sacrificed animals, they were at odds with each other. And at a point at which Quetzalcoatl had become sick, Tezcatlipoca tricked him into consuming pulque, the fermented sap of the maguey cactus, a ritual beverage that was highly restricted, apart from ritual by the elite. He became inebriated and was tricked into accidentally committing incest with his sister. From the shame of that, he was banned from the city. And he and his followers passed between Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl volcano on their way to the Gulf Coast. And at that point, many of his followers froze to death. When he did get to the coast, though, he set himself fire on a raft of snakes and sailed east, where he rose as Venus, the morning star. So Venus, the third most important celestial body to Mesoamerican peoples, and especially the Aztecs, which actually dictated times at which it was appropriate to go to war, rose and is considered the manifestation of the feathered serpent, the rising sun, in a 584-day period that we call the path of Venus. Now, here's the crux of the webinar. The people who made their way into the Valley of Mexico, the Chichimecs, under the guidance of Xolotl, or sacred dog. This comes from a map called the Mapa Tlotzin of the Chichimec migration into the Valley of Mexico. They allied themselves with people of noble lineage of Toltec descent in the Valley of Mexico. Now, the ones we know the most about are the Mexica, the Aztecs, who were the last to arrive to the Valley of Mexico, and their legend is that they originated in a place called Aztlan, as I mentioned. That could have been this island city called Mezcal Titan off the coast of Nayarit, in this lagoon, which is laid out to the 4 cardinal directions, an island town. Could have been their ancient homeland, could have been a place in Jalisco State to the west of us, and as the point of my webinar is getting to, could have been right here where we are in Guanajuato State. As they travel, and you can see here a depiction from one of the early codices, they leave this island city, travel across the lake, and then the footprints depict their on-land migration towards Teotihuacan curved peak, which is an actual, and here you start to mix myth again with reality. This is an actual mountain in the Valley of Mexico. We're not sure if it's the mountain they were referring to in the myth, and inside the cave. The holy trinity of Mesoamerica was the sky, the mountain, and the cave. And of course, that universal story about humans emerging from the cave can be seen here. This is another depiction using date glyphs of the migration happening. Here they are. You've got these emblems that represent Huitzilopochtli and other patron deities held by their elite priests as they migrate south to the Valley of Mexico. Stopping along the way, they would stop for as many as 20 days at a time. They would perform ritual, especially at a place called Chicomostoc and the mountain Teotihuacan. Here you see a depiction of the 7 caves of Chicomostoc, where a ceremony of rebirth. Here's a priest holding a staff at the entrance of the cave, a coyote priest performing a ceremony at the top of the mountain, upon which, at this point, Huitzilopochtli came to them and designated them the Mexica. Today, the word Mexico comes from Mexica, M-E-X-I-C-A, and Mexico itself literally translated as the umbilical cord of the moon. But from these 7 caves emerged the 7 tribes that were different groups of people, loosely referred to as Aztec. Then at this point, at Chicomostoc, referred to as the Mexica. The 7 tribes migrated towards the Valley of Mexico. Now, at Cañada de la Virgen, this image was found painted in a bowl that was an offering for a burial, and it looks like a sun with perhaps 7 flares of fire around it, interpreted by Gabriela Cepeda as the sun and the 7 moons of the Otomi. The Otomi being the only non-Nahuatl speaking people to make it into the Valley of Mexico. Their language family was Otomanguean, more similar to Zapotec spoken in Oaxaca, unique, and builders of Teotihuacan, occupiers of Toltec Tula. But there's 7 canyons that lead up to the mesa upon which the archaeological site is located, and an interpretation is that perhaps this could have been what the Aztecs referred to as Chicomostoc. And as you can see on the map here, coming from Gabriela's book, you have Guanajuato State. Here is the Aztec capital, and this is very possibly an area from which the Mexica or the Chichimecs and other groups migrated through to get to the Valley of Mexico. Could it be that here where we live in Guanajuato State was the actual Aztlan, or a place called Chicomostoc, the ancient ancestral homeland of the Aztecs? That's the question that I hope to try to answer. Another story, another place they stopped along the way was at Coatepec, or Serpent Mountain, where Coyolxauhqui, the Aztec god of the moon, was tending a temple dedicated to the earth goddess. She's known as the woman with bells on her face. As you can see, bells here on the face, which is actually a reference to the lunar eclipse. When the eclipse comes about, the lunar eclipse, and the moon is blocked out, the stars around the moon they pop out and become visible and represent the bells on the face of Coyolxauhqui. Now, the legend is that she gave birth to 400 offspring. Those 400 offspring lived at the base of the mountain, and while she was tending the temple and sweeping at the temple and caring for the temple dedicated to the earth goddess, a ball of feathers fell down from the sky and impregnated her. Now, this extramarital form of impregnation was considered shameful to the 400 offspring. So they ascended the mountain to attack their mother and kill her because of the shame that came about from this inappropriate impregnation and pregnancy. Inside of her womb, though, was Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of sun and war. And as they approached, the 400 offspring approached, he exploded from her belly, ripped her to pieces, and did away with the 400 offspring who actually represented the stars. Her body pieces fell to the base of the mountain, and this piece, called the Coyote Stone, was found in this is her face, the woman with bells on her face, and this stone was found in 1978 when people from the light company in Mexico City were digging post holes and found this stone sculpture, which at the base of the Templo Mayor, the main temple, which helped them to discover the main temple of the Aztecs right near the main square, the Zócalo in Mexico City in 1978. Now, as the Mexica made their way, and I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to get this going. As the Mexica entered the Valley of Mexico, they were considered barbarians. They were not agriculturalists, though had probably learned a little bit about agriculture, and were considered the barbarians from the north who came down as unwelcome visitors into the Valley of Mexico, where these elite lineages, the Acolhua, and other people who could claim Toltec descendancy had already occupied the valley. They were pushed off into the margins of the lake, where they devoured serpents, waterfowl, and lived off of the spirulina and the lake, the edges of the lake. A story of resilience that hopefully can be carried on into modern times as Mexico goes through a hard time in its history. This story of resilience is inspiring to me. But as the Mexica tried to form alliances with people in the valley, it was mostly through marriage. So they decided to form a marriage between a Mexica prince and an Acolhua noble princess. But their interpretation of marriage was different. When the Acolhua leaders came to watch the marriage and looked up to the temple to see the priest come out with a married couple. Instead, the priest came out wearing the flayed skin of the princess, because she was to be married to their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, who, by the way, was probably a deified leader who helped them as they left Aztlan on their migration, deified as their patron deity, the god of sun and war. So at the site of the flayed skin of that princess, a battle ensued. Now, a descendant of the actual Huitzilopochtli was named Copil. He had formed an alliance with the Acolhua. He participated in that battle between the Mexica and the Acolhua at the edges of the lake. The story is that Copil was killed in battle, and his heart was thrown onto a small island where cactus grew among the rocks in the middle of Lake Texcoco. That night, the Mexica priest had the vision brought to them by Huitzilopochtli of an eagle landing on a cactus, and were reminded that Copil's heart lay on that island. The next morning, they woke up to see the eagle land on the cactus, and that was the signal that told them, this is where we'll build our city, our great city in the middle of the lake. In these codices, the serpent you'll see in the beak of the eagle is only depicted in post-conquest codices and art. You can see it again here. This was probably something that was put in by Spanish priests who helped interpret the art, representing an element of Satan, or in their Catholic vision, their Catholic worldview. Because the actual pre-Columbian codices don't show a serpent, but show here a bird being devoured. And here, the earliest element of art that depicts the eagle and cactus, you can see on the Coyote Stone, which means sacred house or sacred war house throne, which was one of Montezuma's thrones, where he was depicted here on the left, Huitzilopochtli, Montezuma, and the sun disk in the center. The most interesting part of this sculpture, though, monolithic sculpture, is the back, where you see the first eagle landing on the cactus. Coming from his mouth is what they call, is actually a symbol that represents fire and water uniting, that duality and that suspending of natural forces, which is actually a symbol that represented war, possibly misinterpreted by Spanish priests as a serpent. But that is the first image that represents the eagle landing on the cactus in the founding of Tenochtitlan, which you can see here. The Codex Mendoza comes from before conquest, no serpent there. And here at the base, the heart of Copil, the stone from which the cactus rises, and in the seal of Mexico, you have Copil's heart, the stone, the cactus, the eagle representing the heavens, the cactus possibly the umbilical cord, and the earthly realm. Now, when I went to Toriles and I interviewed Don Gavino, now this is a story I told the last time, I'm going to repeat in briefer terms, but leading up to my culmination here. He lived in a little community over here at the base of this hill called Toriles. When I met with Don Gavino, I asked him, do you know anything, any legends, any stories about the history of the area that you can tell me? Unique stories. He talked about the Bible. I said, not that. I said, what about animals? What about spirits? He told me a couple of ghost stories. And then he told me, you may be talking about the eagle, the snake, and the cactus. I said, yeah, tell me that story. He said, well, on this Quesillo, he lived in the ruins, on the ruins of a pyramid. His home was made out of the stones of the pyramid itself with a thatched roof. It's called the vernacular style and goes back to pre-Hispanic times. He said, on this pyramid, the eagle came and hovered above and flew to the four winds, the four cardinal directions, with this a large giant eagle with a snake in his beak. And the cactus grew from this Quesillo, which are the ruins of the temple upon which this old man lived, Don Gavino. He said the eagle was going to land on the cactus here on this pyramid. But a boy ran out from his house and threw a rock at the eagle, and the eagle flew down to that big lake in the Valley of Mexico. And that's where he built his city. But they built pyramids all along the way to welcome the eagle. But he didn't stop and didn't land until he got to the Valley of Mexico. So I went to another community, a community called San Isidro de la Cañada, which is on the other side of the valley. I talked to another man also in his 80s. I mentioned this story to him, and he said, yes, I know that story. I know Don Gabino, but he told it wrong. And the story isn't that the eagle was afraid of little boys with rocks. Eagles aren't afraid of little boys with rocks. It's that the eagle looked over this area where the pyramid is located, and it wasn't his pyramid. It's the one by my house, which is Cañada de la Virgen, on this mesa in the middle of this valley surrounded by those 7 canyons. And he said the eagle was going to land here. But the eagle noticed there wasn't enough water in this area to support his big city that was to be built in the future, to support the large population of people that would live in Mexico. And both of these people told me this here and this area was going to be Mexico. But the eagle flew down to that big lake because there was more water, this man told me. And Mexico refers to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which is now Mexico City. Okay, that's on top. Now, a third man I talked to in another community called Timatario told me, also in his 80s, he said, I know those 2 guys, they got the story wrong, but we've all heard that. Our grandparents told us the story. But it wasn't that the eagle was afraid of little boys with rocks. It wasn't because of water. It was because eagles are vision animals and they can see into the future. And he knew that eventually, he knew that his people would be using cars and trains and airplanes, and he needed much more room for his big city to be built in the future. And that's why the eagle finally landed on that island in the middle of Lake Texcoco down in the Valley of Mexico so that he could build his large city. And here you can see the Templo Mayor right there near the main cathedral and right near the center of Mexico City. The interesting aspect of that story that those 3 men told me is that, could it be that the Mexica or the Aztecs migrated through the area we call Cañada de la Virgen back in those mythical times I talked about, those mythical historical times? And was it actually this area that the Mexica considered their ancient homeland, Aztlan, perhaps that mythical birthplace where the ceremony was performed, the place they called Chicomostoc, or the land of the 7 caves? That cannot be proven in the archaeological record at the moment. It's a theory. And 12 years ago, when I interviewed those people, this idea came to me. This is what I'm presenting now. So at this point, I want to let you know that the next installment next week, I'm going to talk more about the rulers, the gods, the religion, Nezahualcóyotl, an Aztec poet, and the eventual demise of the Aztecs brought about by the Spanish invasion. And subsequent webinars that I'll be presenting on my own, I'm going to talk about other different aspects I mentioned: art, music, warfare, architecture, different individual Aztec sites. And at that point, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you for listening. Here we go. I tried to fit it all in there. Hope it wasn't too much. Any questions? Feel free.
Hi, Albert.
Yes.
There was a question that came up from one of our participants. The question was, why do we call them Aztecs if they called themselves Mexica? Okay.
The reason for that is that they actually referred to themselves as Aztec in the beginning, and people in the Valley of Mexico referred to them as Aztec because those people referred to their ancient homeland as Aztlan. Whether it be mythical or actual, we're not sure about that. Could have been that island city I talked about, could have been lakes in Jalisco State or here in Guanajuato, or perhaps this area around San Miguel. This is my hypothesis, my theory, but that's why they were called the Aztecs. They referred to themselves, though, after that ceremony at Chichicamostoc as the Mexica. So and the Aztecs were a group that were made up of different groups who all became the Aztecs. The Mexica were a more hereditary genealogical group unto themselves. I hope that answered the question. Within that group that we call Aztec. Any more?
Albert, how will you continue next week with the presentation? What are the topics for next week?
Next week, I'm going to talk about the Otomi and their unique role in the formation of the Aztec Empire. I'm going to talk about Malinalco, that site that was built by the Aztec princess who broke away during the migration. This is something I didn't refer to during what I just told you, but Malinalco was an Aztec princess who formed her own faction as they migrated and formed a city called Malinalco in the state of Mexico, which is one of the only site I know of where the temples are actually carved into the actual bedrock of a mountain and is an actual purely feminine site. I'm going to talk about the poet king, Nezahualcoyotl, who was the king of Texcoco and the Triple Alliance, who was a poet. I'm going to talk about his influence over the Aztecs. And I'm going to talk about what each Aztec king contributed to the building of the empire. And eventually at the end, I'm going to talk about the conquest and how Cortez and his men were able to finally conquer the Aztecs and start the mixing of European and indigenous that we call mestizo in Mexico.
Thank you, Albert. There's a question from Randy. He asks, will you be discussing the food of these peoples?
Yes, that's another category or topic I'm going to continue with. I'll touch more upon that in next week's episode, but in the future and upcoming webinars, I'm going to focus on food. I'm going to focus on art, music, architecture, diet, cosmology, astronomy, different aspects. Each one of these can fill up 1 or 2 hours in and of themselves.
Randy has another question. His question is, do you have theories about the prevalence of violence in Mexico today as it grows out of the warrior culture of the Aztecs?
Definitely linked, in my opinion. As a matter of fact, some of the cartel violence that you'll see and some of the decapitations and whatnot are purposefully linked to the Aztec rituals as a form of intimidation. I was taking a course with a fellow woman tour guide and at the University of Guanajuato, and she had looked on her phone and looked at some of the bloody stuff happening in Sinaloa and some of the cartel violence. And she said, this is a Mexican woman. She said, I think that it's just in our blood. She said, I think with the bullfighting and the cartel violence, it all goes back to the Aztecs and this lust for blood that we just seem to have in us genetically. Those building blocks that go way back to reciprocal sacrifice, child sacrifice to bring the rain, that we call reciprocal sacrifice, really as a way of keeping the cosmos in motion and functioning and to keep the bounty of the earth coming through agriculture, took on a more sinister aspect with the Aztecs because of that one particular deity, Huitzilopochtli, who needed that constant steady flow of human blood to be appeased. It's said by some Spanish chroniclers, priests, that as many as 80,000 people in a year were sacrificed by the Aztecs. You have to keep in mind, though, that the Spanish priests tried to legitimize their conquest by exaggerating this to legitimize their evangelical conquering and conversion of these indigenous people to Catholicism and European lifeways. But in my opinion, that, as well as masonry and stonework, and a lot of Mexicans who go into the US and work in stonework and construction, that innate ability goes back to the pyramid builders. It's all coming from pre-Hispanic times, in my opinion. Yes.
Albert, does that also correlate with the bloody depictions of Christ?
Yes, it's all what we call syncretism. But here's syncretism, the blending of two religions. I mentioned in the first of the 2 previous webinars, syncretism is the blending of 2 religions. The gods became the saints. The 4 cardinal directions, the 4 winds, familiar as the Christian cross. When the Spanish held up the Christian cross, the Aztecs looked at that, they said, we know that, that's part of our symbolism too, we know exactly what that is. Of course, they didn't understand it was about Christ at the time, but bloodletting, cannibalism, the blood of Christ, communion, cannibalism. The Aztecs were said to consume human flesh in their pozole, the elite, as a way of ingesting the power of previous dynasties. All of that mixed together, and the dates as well, and some of the alignments of the buildings to celestial events, like the March 4th entering of the sun as it sets into the pyramid at Cañada de la Virgen is linked to the ceremony that is called the Day of the Xuchil, when they take out the dark-skinned version, or the Day of the Lord of the Conquest, They take the dark-skinned version of Jesus from the main church, the parroquia, and parade it about town with Indian dancers following. If you ask those people in those parades where that tradition comes from, they couldn't actually link it back to a pre-Hispanic event, but the archaeologists at Cañada de la Virgen, Gabriela Cepeda and Dr. Rosana Quiros, the astronomer, are determining more or less that some of these present-day rituals, including the Dia de los Locos, which is in June, which is the crazy Mardi Gras-like parade, actually linked to the time of year when the Aztecs honored the lords of the underworld, and these different important points in the calendar system are linked to present-day Catholic ceremony, sure. All that we call syncretism. S-Y-N.
Albert, Linda King has a question.
Sure.
Albert, Linda King has a question. Do you see the relationship with the Aztec concept of time with current Mexican culture?
Yes, I do, because, well, as it relates to Catholic ceremony, and like I mentioned, that syncretism, their concept of time being cyclical, and the cyclical round, whether it be the 260-day calendar or the 365-day solar calendar, the 260-day ritual calendar, it's a way one of my colleagues, Arturo Morales, would describe it as ceremony, belief. The ceremony that is repeated throughout the calendar year reinforces a belief in the ceremony. The ceremony itself reinforces this the Catholicism, the belief. The ceremony enhances the belief, and the belief, the ceremony, in a cyclical fashion. So it's all cyclical and all repeating. And this is why, for example, I hadn't mentioned this yet. I'm glad you brought this up. That when Quetzalcoatl, the king of the Toltecs, went to the coast of the Gulf Coast, made that raft of snakes and set himself on fire to become the morning star and rise as Venus in the eastern horizon, he told his people, one day I will return. In the year 1 Reed, his birth date was the year 1 Reed in that Aztec calendar. And it was the year 1 Reed that Cortez arrived on the coast of Veracruz. And one of the reasons, which I will address in the next session, that it's possible that Moctezuma, Aztec king, invited Cortez into his city as an honored guest because he believed that he was actually the incarnation of the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, who had come back from the east as predicted in the year 1 Reed. Yes. Anything else?
Yeah, I don't see any more open questions.
Okay. Well, you can see. Oh, by the way, I just want to throw this in there. All archaeological sites in Mexico are closed at the moment because of the pandemic. We're going in a stage by stage reopening process. Some would say it might be a little bit too early. As far as tourism goes, here in San Miguel, the tourists are starting to come back. Archaeological site Cañada de la Virgen is closed at the moment. We're hoping, the rumor is that it would open in August. We're still waiting to see if that happens. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me about tours of the site, you can also look at my website for other tours I give, like the Path of the Feathered Serpent that goes through central Mexico to some of the places I mentioned during the webinar. And if the site does not open here close to town, I'll be doing these webinars over the next few months. And I have an alternate version of the tour to the archaeological site, Cañada de la Virgen, where we don't actually go into the site itself, but we get as close as we can to see it from a slight distance. And it includes a trip to Dr. Rosana Quiros's restaurant and astronomy photographic exhibit. So it's a discounted alternate version of the tour. I've got a few people interested in doing that next week. Just so you know, anyone out there, if you're interested, tell people that that is still possible. So until the site actually opens. And then at that point, when the site does open, we're pretty sure that until the end of this year, we'll probably have certain strict protocols to go by, including face masks, sanitizing gel, social distancing. But at a place like Cañada, it shouldn't be a problem. We'll be out in the open. It's actually a great alternative to tourism in the city and other places because we're out in a natural setting. And as a matter of fact, the municipal government here is promoting an early opening of adventure or rural tourism so that tour guides can start bringing people out into the country, hiking to the top of the volcano, Los Picachos, and places like Cañada. So keep that in mind. If anyone out there is interested in that, I'm here 6 days a week for that, Tuesday through Sunday. And you can get in touch with me directly and I can give you details.
Albert, there's one more question. Do you ever give tours that track some of these Aztec sites? And what about the sites of the Mayan temples?
Yes. Now the two long distance, multiple day trips that I have, the itineraries on my website include the Trail of the Feathered Serpent and the Path of the Jaguar. Now the Trail of the Feathered Serpent goes to Xochitecatl, now bear with me on the names here. Xochitecatl, Cacaxtla, Cholula, Tepoztlan, Chalcatzingo, the museum that was Cortez Palace in Cuernavaca converted into a museum, the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, and Teotihuacan. Now that's a 7-day trip that can be modified and shortened, and it includes Aztec sites, it includes the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, it includes Olmec sites in central Mexico, a Mayan site called Xochicalco, which is in Cuernavaca, and of course Teotihuacan, which is the ancestors of the Aztecs. Malinalco, the one I mentioned, which is the feminine site, built by that Aztec princess, is possible during that one too. It's within striking distance. And then we have the Path of the Jaguar, where I've taken people on a 7 to 11-day trip down to Chiapas, which is the state that borders Guatemala. And those are the Mayan sites like Palenque, with access to Tikal in Guatemala as a side trip, and other sites and places in Chiapas which are Mayan. So you can see those on my website, and I can also do the Yucatan Peninsula, Chichen Itza, Tulum, Cobá, Uxmal, the Puc region, and my favorite, Ekbalam. So yes, all that is possible. And I enjoy doing them. Gets me out of town. Of course, we have to see how things go over the next month or two to see if those sites are opening to the public. And when I've got people already interested in middle and late September going on the Trail of the Feathered Serpent trip. Maybe 6 or 7 people have already asked me about it. I just have to play it by ear and see if those sites are going to be open by then. So yes.
Well, thank you, Albert. Super interesting presentation as usual. And we look forward to next.
Great.
And I'll talk to you about the tour next week. I'd love to go.
Okay, next time we will make sure we don't have that technical issue we had in the beginning there. It kind of cut out a little time for me, but it'll be okay. Next time we'll make sure that doesn't happen, and I hope that everyone who was here today comes back next Thursday.
Thank you so much, Albert.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me a part of it.
Thank you to everybody for joining us.
Okay, bye-bye.
I'll see you next time. Thanks.